Welcome everyone, Christine here with a discussion about Total War Warhammer 3, Immortal Empires, and in this particular video, I am going to be going over the races of Warhammer 3 to talk about which are the ones that fit the meta of a campaign particularly well. So the races that have the best armies, that work within a campaign situation. So they're winning battles at a very good rate. They're not necessarily taking too many casualties because that actually matters. They have good campaign mechanics, good growth, and can accomplish a lot. Versus the races that can't necessarily accomplish a lot. Or even races that might be able to win a lot of the campaign map very quickly, but just are going to be lacking in campaign variety. So unit variety, hero variety, lord variety, all of that is going to count in a significant fashion over here. It's not just a list of races, these races can win a campaign very quickly. No, it's down to what kind of variety do they have? Do you have possibilities in a campaign versus not having possibilities? Do you have decisions and dynamic campaigns, or do you just have very, very limited campaigns? All of that is going to matter. That's what I define the meta as. And let's start with the Beastmen. I think the Beastmen are a C-rated race within the meta of Warhammer 3. The reason I would put them at C, like middle of the road over here, is that they're not a bad race. In fact, Beastmen can do quite well. They handle climate fairly well, but they are a race very limited. They're limited in terms of the armies, they're limited in terms of diplomacy, and they're also incredibly limited in a campaign in the early game where the meat of a campaign is taking place. So Beastmen campaigns kind of end up being pretty bad, in the sense that you play the early game with very limited units, very limited armies, but once you unlock those, you're just steamrolling without any kind of opposition. And that's not a particularly great dynamic. For what it's worth, the Beastmen do work well. It's just the constant limitations that you are having to fight in a campaign, and you are fighting those limitations as opposed to Dread amounting to a good system, which it wasn't in the context of Warhammer 2. Dread worked within the context of Warhammer 2, but it just doesn't work that well within the context of Warhammer 3. So Beastmen campaigns just end up being limited, and obviously the issues of diplomacy doesn't work quite well. I think the way you could define the meta is which races work well within the mechanics, the inherent mechanics of Warhammer 3. So diplomacy, taking territory, building a lot of armies, getting a great variety. Those are the races at the top. Beastmen do eventually get that, but they don't start with it, and crucially, it takes them so long to get it that you're effectively going to win the campaign by the time you unlock the stuff. Not a horrible race, far from it. Just, I would say, more so a horrible early game, though certainly limitations of diplomacy. Bretonnia, interesting choice. Like, Bretonnia, I'd put that as a B tier race. Maybe could be even lower, but here's the thing about Bretonnia. While Bretonnia's diplomatic ability may certainly be limited, and you're certainly going to be pushed in a certain direction with regards to the diplomacy, Bretonnia does have a great deal of choices to make in a campaign. Beyond the issue of like potentially climate, diplomacy, you have choices in terms of armies because you don't have to worry about supply lines. Yes, you do have the peasant economy, which is going to limit your early game, but not necessarily by as much as you might think. Bretonnia has one of the highest growths in the entire game, so they can build a massive economy, they can get access to a lot of unit types, a lot of heroes. Yes, they do have limitations on their roster, they do have limitations on their heroes, they do have limitations on their lords, so they're lacking in the variety, but their cavalry roster is excellent, and you have reasons to use it. Flying cavalry, anti-infantry cavalry, anti-cavalry cavalry, all of those are very powerful. So shock cavalry or melee cavalry, all of that ends up working in Bretonnian campaign. You also have artillery available very early on in campaign, so that's also very useful. You can't really do wrong in a Bretonnian campaign, with one exception. Their infantry roster is just not worth using at all. Or the vast majority of it. Battle Pilgrims and Foot Squires, absolutely, but everything else, all those men-at-arms units, just not worth it. Archers and cavalry is where it's at with artillery. It does work, and it's not a horrible experience, and it's working well within the context of diplomacy. It's working well within the context of taking territory. Chaos Dwarves. Now, in terms of power, they're an S tier race, but in terms of the meta of Warhammer 3, I would say they're A tier. Now, the reason I say they're A tier is going to come down to this fact. Chaos Dwarves have a lot of power. But that power has to be built up. So their early game kind of ends up being limited simply due to that. I would say they just need more money in the early game, just more income from their settlements, more raw materials early on to get them going better, and maybe a bit more, and maybe just a bit better pacing, because right now, the way it works in a Kastorf campaign is you build up a lot of material production, then you get armament production, and then you steamroll the map. That's kind of how a Kastorf campaign is. So just better fine-tuning in respect to that would be great. It feels like with the Kastorfs, they were designed for perhaps the slower pace of the Realms of Chaos map as opposed to Immortal Empires, so maybe some fine-tuning would be in order there. But they do very well. One of the things that actually, they would potentially be even lower, but here's the thing, you at least start with some unit capacity. You don't necessarily need money for those units. You get armaments, you build those unit production structures. You can get some centaurs, you can get some tauruses, you can get some Kadai, you can get some heroes as well. All kinds of heroes. And you have research that's available fairly early on that can increase your hero capacity, as opposed to many other races that might only have one hero on particular type. Kastorfs can get access to all of their heroes very early in a campaign, very quickly, and they can get 2 of them fairly early in a campaign. Without that, if it wasn't for that, and artillery as well, even if it's going to be limited numbers early on, I would say they would be lower. I think just maybe increasing the unit caps. By the way, this would also help the Beastmen if they had like just better baseline of unit caps, so you could just recruit a couple of units fairly early on. Same with artillery with the Kastorfs. If they just had the higher artillery capacity and infantry capacity early on from the very beginning of their campaign, that would actually help them quite a bit in terms of improving their campaigns. That would be my perspective. Demons of Chaos, and I do mean every single demonic campaign. I'm not interested of, Sonage plays different according. Yeah, okay, they do. All the demonic factions are rubbish one way or another. There's different problems, to be sure, in demonic campaigns. Like, Daniel has no inherent good quality, I would say. But when we think of, like, N'Kari, what are N'Kari's strengths? N'Kari's strengths are powerful flanking units and powerful campaign mechanics of vassalization. Okay, but mediocre economies, all of them have mediocre or horrible economies. Best of time with mediocre. They don't generate a lot of money. Many of them have horrible casualty replenishment, or even someone like Khorne who has good casualty replenishment. It doesn't matter because the Blood Host cannot replenish, so ends up being limited anyway. There's just tons and tons of issues with the way the demons in general were designed. I've covered this many videos, but demons wouldn't work well in any Total War game, and they especially don't work well within the context of Warhammer 3. Warhammer 3 is about fighting across a broad area of a campaign map, capturing territory. I'd say Warhammer 3 is the meta of Warhammer 3 doesn't work quite well for factions that are just about 1 or maybe 2 armies fighting on certain portions of the campaign map. And while I know for a fact if you're playing a car, obviously you can dominate the campaign map for vassals, with Scarbrand for blood hosts. It can be done. I don't dispute that. It's just that there's no real harmony. Funny statement that. There's no real harmony between these faction systems, the individual factions that we're talking about, the individual gods, and the broader campaign mechanics. It's when there's that harmony that things work the best. Dark Elves, S-tier race. Great power in terms of diplomacy, great selection of climate choices, funnily enough. Even if they don't necessarily have a lot of different climate types, they have a huge, the climates that they generally have cover huge portions of the campaign map. And that's, by the way, an example. Like, it doesn't have to be every climate is available to a race, but the climates that are available should cover broad areas of campaign map that are connected to each other. One of the problems in the Empire is like, yeah, they might have territories that cover parts of the good parts of the campaign map, but the distances between those parts is so enormous that it doesn't necessarily matter. Dark Elves have Castways, they have Frozen, generally speaking, Temperate Islands. Some of them may have Jungle, for instance, and that gives them a significant amount of variety in their campaigns. They have a lot of choices to make from just the possibilities created by climate, They can get a lot of heroes very quickly in their campaign. And you have decisions to make. Do you push aggressively for the highest possible tier of settlements? Because you can. Like, you can play a Dark Elf campaign and be more passive. Like, just build up a region to like tier 4, tier 5, get access to the highest quality units. Or play the way I do, which is get access to tier 2 as quickly as possible, and then expand it as quickly as possible for a large territory, win a campaign quickly. You have choices in diplomacy, because outside of the High Elves, no one really hates the Dark Elves. Sure, there's a version -40, -50, but you can make it work from a diplomatic standpoint with the Dark Elves. So, great selection of Legendary Lords, great selection of heroes, great selection of units that are actually accessible in a campaign when it matters. Because I'm not interested in what units you can get 60 turns in a campaign. I'm interested in what units a race can get within the first 10 turns of a campaign. Dark Elves have a lot of choices. And it's balancing those choices and building an empire however way you see fit. That is what matters in a Dark Elf campaign. Dwarves. They are D tier. I would rate them even lower. But to be honest, Dwarves at least have one saving grace. They have a really powerful army in the early game. Quarrelers and tier 2 artillery do save them. Problem with the Dwarves is there's very little else that works for them. Diplomatically, they're kind of in a limited spot. They don't get along well with many other races. Big surprise, especially the Order races. And even with Order races, they're not especially chummy with many of them. I mean, with the exception of the notable exception of the Empire and I guess Kebie to some extent. But seriously, the Dwarves don't get along well with many other races. Their hero capacity is limited behind tier 4 settlements, with the exception of runesmiths, and runesmiths require their own separate structure. They are not going to really use for anything else unless you get a couple of iron breakers, and why would you bother? Their quarreler grudge for doom stacks work, but you're just severely lacking in terms of campaign variety in dwarven campaigns in general. That's one of the problems. There's not necessarily as much variety between the Legendary Lords as there should be, with the exception of Grumbrindle, and he really feels completely out of place where he is. I'm not saying his campaign doesn't work. It works well within the first 20 turns, but then it's like you just get hit by the fact you're far away from the main action that's happening in the Dwarven campaign, and that's not especially great. Limited casualty replenishment, just a lot of the issues that races may have in a Warhammer free campaign are present with the Dwarves. The grudge system, their unique campaign mechanic, is not in harmony with the way you are playing a campaign and the campaign map. Lots and lots and lots of problems. They're saved by just the powerful armies they have and the fact that they can get a lot of armor items very quickly in their campaign. They can print money from doing so. So they can win campaigns. They're not struggling in terms of power. They're struggling in terms of campaign variety, army variety, hero variety, lord variety. They really need an update in that. And the Book of Grudges tear it to shreds, I'd say, from my perspective. We move on to the Empire. The Empire is absolutely an F-tier race. Everything goes wrong with the Empire. They have growth, I guess. They can get hero capacity, but here's the problem. Their army rosters, the Empire has some of the weakest armies until tier 3 in the entire game. So basically, the first 10, 20 turns of a campaign of the Empire is the worst experience you can have in a game. Limited armies, limited artillery, limited unit roster, limited hero roster until later on. Yes, the Empire gets great if you conquer the whole Empire 60 turns in. That's when you get decent. But there's races in this game that start with that kind of flexibility from the very beginning. Let me put it like this. The Empire spends 60 turns to get to a point that Dark Elves start at the beginning of the campaigns. And Dark Elves are still better than the Empire because they have better climate situation, better diplomatic flexibility, and better Legendary Lord selection than the Empire. And that's 60 turns in. Even if we're counting the state troopers, the Dark Elves are still better. Hell, even Bretonnia is better. Let alone some other races that I haven't gotten to yet. The Imperial Authority system doesn't mesh well with the campaign map. The hostility system doesn't work well with the campaign map. The books of Nagash that Volkmar has don't work well with the campaign map. Though the books are actually the least offensive item on this list. There's very few redeeming qualities about how the Empire fits the meta. Yes, they have casualty replenishment, they get the decent economy, they have decent growth. So they have some things going for them, but everything else, their unit roster selection, win a campaign when it matters, pretty crap. Then you have Kebie. Oh yeah, Kebie, I would say Cafe is a B tier race. I like in terms of strength, you could consider them A tier or S tier, but how well they work within the meta of a campaign, that is a different discussion. So I would say Cafe goes to B tier for the following reason. Cafe is in many ways what the Empire would dream it would have. In the sense, Cafe actually has a good unit roster early on. Jade Warriors, Jade Warrior Crossbowmen. You can't do wrong with that. You can win the entire campaigns with Jade Warriors and Jade Warrior Crossbowmen. But that's the problem. Their early game situation is great. Like, if I was just rating this based on, like, the first 10, 20 turns of a campaign, I would consider Cafe A or S, potentially. Probably A. Not quite S, in terms of how they fit the campaign meta. But the problems come in long term. Climate limitations are absolutely a problem in a Cafe and campaign. The Harmony system is just a gimmick. The compass is just a gimmick. None of them add anything. The limitations on casualty replenishment. We really need a casualty replenishment hero for Cafe to add things to them. And we need a better climate situation. Because right now, when you're playing a Cafe and campaign with exception on bow, yeah, you conquer all of Cafe in 20 turns, and then what? What else does a Cafe and campaign have to offer? Very little. First 20 turns, they're certainly up there with many other races, but it's after that there's no reason to play a Cafe and campaign after that point. You do have Siege Artillery at tier 4, at tier 3. You have your version of Hellstorm Rocket Batteries at tier 4. You have Flying Hellstorm Rocket Batteries at tier 5. There's many things that work with Cafe. Their economy, their Lord selection, even their heroes, even though you don't have a melee hero, it works well. Add the Gate Guard, or however he's going to be called, the Game Master, doesn't matter. And you will have a better situation, but we really need that casualty replenishment. We don't need training in a Cafe and campaign, believe it or not. We don't necessarily need training. Or we could have a hero that adds both training and casualty replenishment, make that choice for a player. Certainly can be done, I'd argue. But yeah, Cafe just has those longer term limitations, but early on they're pretty good. And Yanbo can work in a longer term campaign, minus the casualty replenishment situation, the casualty replenishment problem. Greenskins. Now, Greenskins, absolutely S tier race. Great economy, huge amount of income potential early on, very powerful growth, one of the best in the game. Same with Bretonnia. Actually, Bretonnia has better growth, but Greenskins actually get a lot of money from sacking and looting settlements. So does Bretonnia, mind you, but Greenskins have cheaper units. Great hero variety, great Lord selection, and the climate they have in their campaigns, with the exception of Grom, poor Grom. But the climate selection of a campaign is also great, because like you play Grimgor, you look at the territory Grimgor has. He has a huge area of the campaign map to expand in. Or you look at Izak, he's got the entire empire, the entire mountains, the entire Darklands to take. That's all suitable to him. Very few lords have that. Skarsnik, even Jacob of Skarsnik or Wurzag, they have great choices and dynamics in their campaign. Oh, but Greenskins are universally hated. Well, that's fine, because when you're universally hated by a lot of factions, you do have to make decisions based on that. I'd say the worst factions are those that are very liked by some and hated by others. Like, yeah, Empire is in that category. Greenskins being hated by so many factions actually forces you to play a campaign in a very different way, and forces you to make choices in those campaigns that you wouldn't necessarily do in other campaigns. Because you will get a lot of power very quickly, and then suddenly everyone will turn against you. And suddenly, you are fighting the world, which suits the Greenskins just fine, because they get very strong for fighting everyone. There's a lot of power, there's a lot of variety in these campaigns, and these campaigns are fun in the early game, fun in the main game, even late game. Like, there's a great unit roster from early game until the very late game. There's powerful units from Goblin Archers to Nasty Skulkers to Big Guns to Black Orcs, even Savage Orcs if you want to use those, or the big monstrous units. You can't go wrong with basic Trolls or Stone Trolls. The artillery is kind of weak, but I mean, Stone Trolls are good in sieges, so do you need artillery when you got Stone Trolls and Nasty Skulkers to win siege battles? Not necessarily so, I'd argue. And who needs artillery when you got Grimgor? High Elves. Another B tier race. This may come as a shock to a lot of people. The High Elves are a really powerful race. You can win a campaign with the High Elves, their basic army, their Spearmen and Archer line. But that's it. You get powerful Lord selections, sure, but you have limitations. I can use the load save character system to bypass it, and I do. I highly recommend you do so. You can use the load save character system to bypass the annoyance of influence, but I think like the influence system is just a very outdated system. It made sense within the context of Warhammer 2 because you would build them due to supply lines and due to the pacing of a campaign, you had dozens and dozens of turns, potentially, or over a dozen turns before you recruited a second army there, or a third army. So the influence limitation wasn't as big of a factor. It certainly is a big of a factor in Warhammer 3. Just the campaign meta is faster. The pace of the game is faster. We can conquer a lot more territory. And the problem with the High Elves is not that they don't succeed in this. It's just that the systems they have, hero capacity only increasing at tier 4 for all of their heroes, unless you're playing like Alariel, who can get at tier 3, but that's the exception, or Imric, who gets a bunch of nobles through his special skill line, but only through a couple of them through his special skill line. But outside of that, you do have a lot of limitations that are trying to slow you down, but they don't really slow you down, so they're not working well within that meta. Also, climate limitations that are felt in a campaign. Like, you compare the High Elves, the Dark Elves, I'll tell you what the difference is between the Dark Elf and the High Elf campaign. Dark Elves can conquer a vast array of territory for the map. High Elves get stopped by Chaos Wasteland. That's the difference. Like, I know it's just one climate type, but even one climate type can make such a huge difference in a campaign experience. Now, High Elves, as I stated, High Elves will do well. But another thing to mention about High Elves is, while they get along well with playing the Order races, they don't get along well with Disorder races. So you end up kind of pigeonholed in a campaign down one particular path, regardless of which campaign you're playing. Actually, Imric's campaign might be one of the more interesting ones out there, until you realize just Wolf 1 for High Elves is such an enormous benefit, far more so than Dark Elves get. Wolf 1 is so significant and gives you such power that even in a campaign as Imric or Elfarian, where you might think, oh, I want to play on this other side of the map, really you realize you're going back to Wolf 1 and you're staying in Wolf 1. That's a sad part. I think like High Elves just need better access to heroes, reduction in cost of influence for just reduction in cost for the influence spending that they have in a campaign. And honestly, you can use influence to change the diplomatic situation around. I'd say the influence affecting diplomacy system is certainly very, very archaic, considering what we can do with diplomacy in Warhammer 3, as opposed to how things were in Warhammer 2. So in that respect, I'd say High Elves, there's still a great race. You won't completely hate your life playing them. Far from it. They're great to play. Like the B tier races over here so far, they're still good races to play, just more limited than the ones above. That's what I would say. Kislev, another D tier race. I wouldn't put them quite F tier. Kislev, if it wasn't for Boris Ursus, and to a certain extent Oxtankia, like if I was judging Kislev just by Kastaltin and Katrin, they would be F tier minus. That's how horrible Katrin and Kastaltin are. But you play Boris Ursus, you play Oxtankia, it's a much better campaign situation. Problem with Kislev. So what's Kislev's issue? Is it climate? Kind of. Like, if for Katrin Kastaltin, absolutely climate is a severely limiting factor in your campaign. Though you do have Frozen and you do have the Empire, so there's a lot of choices. And you have Mountains, so it's not horrible. But if you look at Boris Ursus, he does have Wasteland ability. Like, basically, there's a huge difference between Oxtankia and Boris Ursus and the other two. Like, the two miserable, bratty children of Boris Ursus. That's how I would describe Kislev right now. The issue is, the supporter system is garbage. Oxtankia's unique campaign system is also not particularly great in terms of its design. The race does have some really good units in it. You are lacking in artillery, so sieges are an annoyance until you get tier 4, so that's obviously a severely limiting factor in your campaign. But you do have open field battle situation, and even with sieges, you can use masses of range units to win sieges. Not particularly fun, but it does work. You do have great replenishment, you do have powerful magic, you have a lot of things going for you if you're playing Kislev. The problem in a Kislev campaign, they might handle early game. If you're playing Ursus or Oxtankia, they might handle that fine. Katrin and Kastaltin don't quite as well. But the issue with Kislev, the really significant issue, beyond like, things like problem with not having artillery, all that, their lord selection choices, because they only have boyars until the train high switches, and they have severe limitations on that. The problem in a Kislev campaign, the way I define it, is going to boil down to their economy. Kislev's economy is one of the worst scalable economies in the entire game. And it's not even a situation like some other races, which might also have a limited economy, but they have some mitigating factors. There's few mitigating factors around Kislev's economy. The only reason Kislev can sustain its forces in the campaign is they get a good amount of post-battle loot and income from looting and sacking settlements. But Kislev just generates very, very little money in a campaign, to the point that it might not even be worth it to actually conquer a lot of territory, which doesn't fit within the meta very, very well. But playing passively doesn't fit within the meta. I understand what CA is trying to do with Kislev. It is not a system that works. And by the way, playing passively clashes with Kislev's supporter system, which you do care about. That's where the problems come in. Kislev is not a faction where you sit on your ass. There's no faction that encourages really that kind of playstyle. All factions, regardless of who they are, encourage an active playstyle. Kislev especially because of the supporters, because the best way to earn supporters is through Boris Ursus. But on the other hand, taking territory feels rather meaningless as Kislev, because it takes 10 turns to get your return on investment. And that's with the tier 1 economic building, let alone others. So I guess in the very, very long term, sure, if you conquer half the freaking world, it works. But like, you have a huge gap between, like, say, turn 20 and turn like 80 in a Kislev campaign, where it's going to be pretty awful. After that, if you've captured like half the map, sure, I suppose. That's not a great campaign experience. They do not fit well within the campaign dynamics. Lizardmen. Oof, this is going to be an interesting one. Lizardmen are D tier. Problem with Lizardmen, their economy, their army costs outpace their economy. Their economy is not horrible, but their units cost far more. Hero capacity, tier 4. Increasing capacity, it's not exactly great. The way the Lizardmen economy handles, the way their hero capacity handles, the way their unit variety is limited because of that limitation on economy. Just so many issues. Yes, Oxyatl is one of the best campaigns, so there are exceptions. Tenowin also works surprisingly well in a campaign, as I've learned rather recently. Like, Tenowin works far better than I would have expected, just the scalability of it. But the baseline Lizardmen as a race, they're a jungle race that moves slow in jungles. How stupid is that? Like, consider this. Their natural climate is the jungle. They are one of the worst races to actually handle the jungle, not just because of movement speed, but because their limited economy means they're limited armies, which means that you have to defend territory on different sectors, or you have to expand on different sectors, but you leave other sectors undefended. And that's a pretty bad dynamic to deal with a Lizardmen campaign. It's why Tenowin and Oxyatl are so exceptional, because they break the rules, but the rules everyone else has to follow, like Mazdamundi, Kragar, Garok, even Tic-Tac-Toe, it's not a great campaign dynamic that any of those have to deal with, at least in the jungle. Once you move past that, yeah, it gets better, but just a lot of limitations on Lizardmen, and certainly a race in need of a rework. Not a horrible race to play, but just doesn't mesh well within the campaign meta. Norska, F tier. Oh, F tier by far. Like, Norska might seem reasonable enough as a race. They are not. They are horrible in Autoresolve. Their casualty replenishment requires tier 4 to increase. They have this dynamic that I've talked about in videos where when you attack a settlement as a Norska, here's what you're going to do. You attack a settlement. Like, they deserve F tier just for this alone, so I'm not going to mention anything else about Norska. When you attack a settlement as Norska, here's what you want to do. You want to first sack it. Oh, yeah. You want to first sack it, then the turn after that, then you click the intern button. The turn after that, you want to raise it, then you either get the second army to occupy it, or the same army might get lucky, isn't moving from a position you can occupy it. But regardless, you want to occupy it. And then Then you want to rebuild it, but you don't want to keep it because unless it's a port, because the economic potential of that settlement is going to be very limited. So what you do is you sell it to a faction and eventually vassalize half the map because you have diplomatic vassalization. Do I need to say anything more about Norska? Does that sound incredibly stupid and badly designed? Because it is. Like, Norska has a good army. That's it. Norska for a melee faction has a good army. They're not unique in that respect. But just like that dynamic, and that's the best way to play him. Like, I don't care how you might want to play, but that's what you want to do in a Norscan campaign. Sack a settlement for the money it's going to give you. Raise a settlement to please the gods, which, by the way, you need to do in order to win your campaign and get economic benefits to actually make your territory worth it, and only the ones with ports. The monster hunts that they have, another unique campaign mechanic, like, so much broken with Norska. Like, I'll be blunt in this. Like, let me just rearrange this a bit so I can just put them in order how I view the races. Like, if I was putting a race at the bottom of this list in terms of campaign meta, they're not the worst race to play, to be certain on it. But in terms of how they fit in the campaign meta, Norska is. There needs to be another list. Like, I'm tempted to make another tier list just to make a tier list of the worst possible races in the game with the tier markings, and just to make an F tier for an F tier to put Norska on it. That's how horrible Norska is. Because what I just described is the Norskan experience. Beyond the fact, like, it can work. You can become a dominant power on the campaign map. I've done it. It's one of the easily one of the most awful campaign experiences that exists, not just in Warhammer, but in Total War as a whole. Like, yeah, Norska is that awful. It really needs an update. Ogres. Oh, man. Ogres. They're a bit better than Norska because they don't have this incredible stupidity of, like, sacking a settlement, raising it, occupying it, rebuilding it, selling it again. But make no mistake, Ogres are still pretty crap. Maybe not as bad as the Demon Prince. Let's be a bit fair to Ogres, because Ogres at least get access to, like, their Ogre Bulls and the variants of Ogre Bulls and all that. Engorgers are pretty decent units, but Ogres are just designed for such a limited campaign, and the meta of Warhammer 3 is about expansionist campaigns. Ogres are not a passive race. Their economy is not designed for a passive race. They're an economy, they're supposed to be raiders and marauders and mercenaries. That's not how Ogres play, though. Like, it's such a sad state of affairs. Like, the mercenary system and contracts should have been so much better. But the contracts are largely meaningless, except the odd contract that increases your camp growth. Your camps are an incredible limitation until 70 turns of your campaign when you get unlimited camps, if you're building up for that. Fair enough. But, like, the fact it takes 60, 70 turns to get to that position, it should tell you everything you need to know about Ogres. Their hero capacity is tied to camps, their economy is tied to camps, everything's tied to camps. You still want to take a lot of territory as Ogres, but take into consideration Greases' campaign. Let's consider Greases. He has Xiao Ming to the east, who's a far better legendary lord of a far better race. He has Gorse to the south, far better lord, far better race. He has Grimgor to the north. Tell me, and he has Drazov to the west. Out of those 4 campaigns I just described, do you want to play Greases, who's easily the worst? Or do you want to play any of the 4 that I just mentioned, who are all going to be far better than him? Scrag? Okay, Scrag is in a better situation. Guess what? Scrag is worse than Greases, because Greases gets a camp for free for his skill line, Scrag doesn't. So, end of discussion, really. Ogres, not worth it. Oh, like, it's pretty telling that both of the pre-order DLC races, even if Norska was added to Warhammer 1 first, but both the pre-order DLC races are at the bottom of this very list. CA just doesn't handle the design of them very well. I mean, I think the Amazons of Troy were a far better situation, and maybe CA should follow that model. Sea Peoples, yeah, you know what? Sea Peoples, which you might consider pure bonus, yeah, Sea Peoples are... in Pharaoh are actually in a better situation. Not this. Day 1 DLC races need to die. Like, it could be a pre-order bonus where we get the first DLC for free. Fair enough. Later on the line, but the way it's been handled with Warhammer 1, 2, and 3 has been horrible. Warriors of Chaos, well, I'll get into those in a moment. Skaven, S tier race. build higher tier settlements very quickly in a campaign, no problem, end up expanding across a vast array of territory, having good climate situation. They are universally hated in a campaign, so that's actually going to be a main worry. But being universally hated like the Skaven and Greenskin to a lesser extent are is not necessarily a downside. It does force you to play a campaign in a different way. So you have a lot of tools, you have a bunch of selection choices of Legendary Lords, you have a bunch of lore choices, you have so much variety in terms of army choices, hero choices, lore choices. It's incredible. Main limitation is you don't handle two region provinces well, economically speaking, though it might give you the food benefit you need. Undercity does feel like a gimmick, but overall Skaven do handle campaigns fairly well. Though Ike, Claw, and Fraud don't have the best starts, but that's a specific situation of how the terrain of their campaigns is, and just the terrain, not them as Legendary Lords specifically. I'd say the Skaven Tier 1 situation is pretty horrible. I think Night Runners should be available Tier 1 for everyone, just a perspective, not just Clannish. Tomb Kings, similar to the Beastmen actually. C tier, not a horrible race in a campaign dynamic, just a really slow early game because of limited armies, similar to the Beastmen. But once you get rolling as the Tomb Kings, you dominate the map. So similar as the Beastmen, unless you're playing Archon, in which Archon would be considered a B tier campaign, but still just not a really great campaign. It's annoying in a Tomb King campaign because, like, oh, you get a downside in terms of diplomacy with other Tomb Kings as Archon. As if anyone cares that's playing a Tomb King campaign. Because I'll tell you how you play a Tomb King campaign. You have to eliminate all the other Tomb Kings to win the campaign. That is not a great dynamic. So, though Tomb Kings do very well in terms of diplomacy because they have vassalization through diplomacy, they're not hated by that many people. It's just the limitations on armies that are a problem. Like, Tomb Kings work well in the long term, but they only work well in the long term. Their early game is quite awful because you only have one army. That severely limits your choices. Like, the fact it takes you 15 turns to get an extra army, just one extra army, is insane. Consider Greenskin, Dark Elves, Skaven. You might be running 4 full stacks in 20 turns. Tomb Kings might get 2 armies in 20 turns, 2 full armies. Because obviously once you recruit that second army, you have to recruit units for it. So that's going to take several turns as well. So yeah, just Tomb Kings need an update. I'd say they all need to start with an extra army. Maybe to remove that extra army benefit that Archon has, just give it to everyone as well. And make confederations possible for everyone except Archon. Like, yeah, Archon confederating, maybe that wouldn't work necessarily, but still, all the same. Vampire Coast. Yeah, I would say Vampire Coast are not as bad as Norska, but they're still pretty bad. Not as good even as Demons, and I certainly don't have great opinion of Demons. See, the thing about Vampire Coast, within the context of Warhammer 2, you look at the Vortex map. Remember this, Vampire Coast was designed for the Vortex map of Warhammer 2. They were not designed for Immortal Empires, they were designed for the Vortex map. You look at that Vortex map, you play that Vortex map. You see the possibilities on that Vortex map, they're incredible. You look at the balancing of campaigns of Warhammer 2, the limitations on armies, the slower pace inherently because expanding across a vast array of territory in Warhammer 2 is a really good way of spending a lot of resources quickly and losing a campaign. It's not great. There's lots of issues in Warhammer 2, but Vampire Coast was designed for Warhammer 2 and have not aged gracefully. Warhammer 2, different situation. Altogether, completely different situation. But just because a race was good in a previous game does not make it great in the next one. Just one of those things. Like, I understand a lot of people have great perceptions of Tomb Kings and Vampire Coast, and I'm committing high heresy, but they don't fit the meta very well. Their unit roster is pathetic. Their economy is pathetic. And you might say, oh, you don't have to play the Vampire Coast as a land-based economy. To which I reply, well, how are you going to make money then? It's not like... I mean, this is the thing. Beastmen don't have to take a lot of territory. Do you know how they get away with that? They get away with that because their units cost nothing. Tomb King units cost nothing. Vampire Coast units, yeah, their armies are expensive. They're not cheap. But they're also worthless armies because the vast majority of the unit roster, with the exception of monsters, depth guard, and artillery, is not worth recruiting at all. And even Aranessa, who can recruit like Sartosan units, she's still not in a great situation because... Okay, let me put it like this. When you're playing a Vampire Coast campaign, you have this dilemma. In order to increase your hero capacity, you need Pirate Coves. Problem is, those pirate coves can only be built in ports. You know what else can be built? You know what else you can do with ports? Oh, you can take them for money. And that hero capacity is, there's only one building slot in those pirate coves, and you can only, and you have to choose, do you increase hero capacity or do you get some money? You can get a lot of money for it, absolutely, but it's just like, that limitation is not great. I would say if they worked more like Undercities and had multiple building slots, Vampire Coast would work well. But between their crappy unit roster, the limited campaign mechanics, the limited lords that have Horde armies, there's a huge discrepancy between Horde armies and regular armies for Vampire Coast. All of those like lead to very limited campaigns and turn simulators. That's what I would say a Vampire Coast campaign is all about. Very, very limited. Made sense in the context of Warhammer 2, doesn't make sense for the context of Warhammer 3. Vampire counts. If we're thinking about vampire counts, I would actually say vampire counts are really a top tier race in Warhammer 3. Shockingly. But let me give you an idea of why that is. You have, like, vampire counts, even though they've only gotten one DLC, surprisingly, vampire counts, despite that, and despite seemingly very little effort, they've remained relevant throughout the history of Warhammer, of Total War Warhammer as a race. And in fact, I would say the incarnation of Warhammer 3 as one of the initial races of Warhammer 1, their incarnation of Warhammer 3 is the best they've had in the series so far. But how is that? Well, vampire counts have a huge diplomatic ability with a lot of races. They can get along well with virtually everyone. So you want to fight on the forces order, you can do so. You want to fight on the forces of disorder, you can do so. You want to take over the empire, burn it to the ground, go ahead. You want to make everyone your vassal and your friend, go ahead. So many choices with that. You get those named lords through the bloodlines that give you a lot of power in a campaign and various faction-wide effects. That's great for blood kisses. And there's a lot of them. Realistically, like in a Vampire Counts campaign, you probably will never unlock all of them. Unlike the Vampire Coast, where you can unlock easily all of those and then you run out of things to do. You can recruit, you have a huge army variety simply because you can recruit high tier units from relatively early on in a campaign. Get involved in a major battle. Lose half your army, doesn't matter. Just recruit it back up again. That's what's great. And the units you're actually recruiting, unlike the Coast, are actually good. Graveguard are good. Hexdraves are good. Cavalry is good. Yes, you don't have artillery, but the diplomatic power comes into play. So this is what makes the Vampire Counts great. They work exceptionally well because of the diplomatic overhaul of Warhammer 3. So they fit within that diplomatic overhaul, the Legion system, the output system. They have access to vassalization for diplomacy. There's a lot of power, a lot of flexibility, and just overall a great experience in a Vampire Counts campaign, especially as Vlad or Isabella, either of those two. Manfred, yeah, probably less so. Gorst is boring with zombies, though there's nothing stopping Gorst from using regular Vampire Counts armies and just filling up with zombies as filler units in those armies and using his superpower zombies. But yeah, there's a lot of power. Maybe there's less Legendary Lord variety than they should be, but this is not about Legendary Lords. Yes, Legendary Lord variety does matter in this list, so like Dark Elves are higher because they have that better. I'm not sure. Would I rate Skaven or Vampire Counts? I don't know. The diplomatic variety of counts does count for a lot, but yeah, the Legendary Lord selection of Skaven is better. But this is about races, and while I think the Vampire Counts could use a lot better Legendary Lord variety, maybe an extra Legendary Lord certainly would be welcome. Just the way their campaigns are handled from a racial perspective is amazing right now. Like, climate situation is pretty solid. Diplomatic situation is pretty good. There's very few complaints except like not having range units and artillery. And you can kind of get some you can get some range units for a certain bloodline, though limited in number. And you can get artillery through the Legion system, the outpost system. So it kind of works out. Warriors of Chaos. Interesting choice. I wonder where to put Warriors of Chaos. So they've got the largest selection of Legendary Lords, and there's variety in their playstyles. I would probably have to put them at C. I think they are better than the Beastmen, and I would say the Tomb Kings are also better than the Beastmen. But The reason with Warriors of Chaos not being quite high tier, yes, they have a huge variety in terms of their armies. They have a huge variety in terms of their heroes and heroes, though there's only 2 hero types, but it's that variety of like different subtypes. So that works very well. Climate, all that. So why aren't they rated higher? Well, here's the issue from my perspective. Vassals can be great. And like if they are adding to experience. So like vampire counts, one of the things to understand about vampire counts, you have vassals, but you also have a lot of armies. Warriors of Chaos are limited in the number of armies. They're limited in the number of settlements. They don't have anything at stake in a campaign. You play a vampire counts campaign, yeah, you have to hold a lot of territory. But Warriors of Chaos, taking territory is meaningless outside the Dark Fortress. They have no vulnerabilities. They have no weak points. And when you have no weak points, you don't have any concerns. You don't have any issues to worry about. You just troll around the campaign map. Like, seriously, forget the changeling. Warriors of Chaos just run around the campaign map, decimating everything in the path. When you start a campaign and you know you've won it the moment you've started that campaign or the moment you've taken your first Dark Fortress, that's not a great campaign. There needs to be something at stake, and there's nothing at stake for Warriors of Chaos. Also, they're limited. Also, while they can subjugate a lot of races, they have a lot of diplomatic power because of that. Ultimately, other cast factions like them, Order factions hate them, so you just end up playing the campaigns again and again. Don't get me wrong, playing a campaign as Valkia from time to time, just making everyone in Nagaron your puppet, and hell, everyone in Ulfwan as well your puppet is great. You are basically more powerful than Skarbrand and Akari combined as Valkia. And there's a great variety in units and heroes and all that, and climate, so you'd think that would work well, but it's just... They go too far in the direction in the sense like you have nothing to lose, nothing to fear, no concern, no risk. You lose an army and you lose experience units and you have to start from scratch. Okay, is anyone going to attack your Dark Fortress? Is anyone going to get through the wall of vassals to go through the Chaos Wasteland for attrition to attack your Dark Fortress? Hell, is anyone even going to threaten you as Festus, who has one Dark Fortress right next to another? No. The only dilemma in Warriors of Chaos campaign is like trying to decide whether or not you want to vassalize smaller factions or take a lot of territory that's worthless in itself, but reducing major factions and then selling that territory to them bit by bit. That's the only dilemma in a Warriors of Chaos campaign. It's not especially great. If you want to play a Steamroll campaign from turn 1, sure. If you just want to play a Brain Dead campaign, I would recommend them. But outside of that, just not really a great campaign in a lot of ways. So in some ways, they're even worse than Tomb Kings and Beastmen, because Beastmen and Tomb Kings do have things at stake. They can lose campaigns if you're playing them. But all the same, like, yeah, there's a lot of variety, hero variety, unit variety, even if it's just subtypes, even if it's the same units, but they are used in different ways. So you do have choice and consequences. So yeah, I'd rate them higher Tomb Kings than Beastmen, but yeah, beyond that, I don't think I can go higher. And that just leaves Wood Elves. Oh my. Where would I put the Wood Elves? This is an interesting question. See, Wood Elves as a race, when you think about it, they've got campaign flexibility. They can go to any point of the campaign map, or vast majority of them, through the teleportation of trees. They've got diplomatic flexibility with a lot of races. Not all of them, but a significant number of them. So they're not playing one-note campaigns necessarily. At the same time, I think like Wood Elves are D tier. Like, it's... Let me explain how this is. So I do think like, and by the way, like, yeah, I'd say Kislev is better than Dwarves. Here's my perspective on Wood Elves. The units are strong. The unit variety is there. The hero variety is real. The Legendary Lord variety is real. But there's even less at stake in a Wood Elf campaign than Warriors of Chaos. At least the Warriors of Chaos, you have to take territory for your vassals, if nothing else. In Wood Elf campaigns, you don't even have to do that outside like an initial province that you start in with your lord fighting, like Ostermark as Drika, the mountains as Durfu, all that. You don't have to care about it. Like, a Wood Elf campaign is just about sitting on your ass waiting for something to happen, the growth of trees. Like, once you take a province next to a tree, you wait for it to grow and deal some events, all that. It is not a good campaign dynamic in a Warhammer free campaign. Sure, you have the flexibility to do a lot of crazy stuff and ally a lot of races. And you do have individual powerful armies, but it's like one of those situations similar to Warriors of Chaos, and I'd say worse than Warriors of Chaos because the reason it's worse, Warriors of Chaos at least can win their campaigns quickly enough, right? Wood Elves have to wait dozens and dozens and dozens of turns to regrow the big tree. That's not fun. Like, the Forest Health, like, if that was buffed, that would be better. I'm not quite sure what CA could do with the Wood Elves. Like, that's kind of the sad thing about the Wood Elves. The rework we got in Warhammer 2 was great for Warhammer 2. In Warhammer 3, how do you make Wood Elves more interesting when inherently their campaign dynamics are for them to sit on their ass, but the campaign dynamics overall for the game are to be active on the campaign? It's not even about aggressive expansionist, I would say. It's about being active, not sitting on your ass, not playing the intern simulator. But that's the problem with Wood Elves. They're forced to do so. That's the issue. Like, more so than many other races. So in some ways, you could consider them worse than Lizardmen, because Lizardmen at least are active on the campaign map. Wood Elves are not. Like, your basic army of Glade Guard can demolish vast majority of foes, and then you get variants of Glade Guard that will deal with pretty much anything, let alone the higher tier units. So I'd say, like, Wood Elf campaigns, like, they need the reason to be more active in a campaign, as opposed to just sitting on your ass dozens and dozens of turns, never having anything at stake. I know, maybe Forest Health being accelerated if you're fighting foes. I have no idea, really. Maybe having a campaign resource that you can spend to regrow trees at your leisure that you gain from battles, that would give you a reason to be more active. That's for certain. Though, that would just give you a reason to exploit producing a faction to one settlement and sacking that settlement again and again and again, which probably wouldn't be the best thing. But hey, I think like Wood Elves need a reason to be more active on the campaign than they are. And right now they're built around systems that don't mesh well with the Warhammer free campaign. And that would be it. Costin signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications. Let me know how you feel about all of this. I'm sure plenty of people will have issues with the Vampire Coast, Tomb Kings, Warriors of Chaos, and all that, as they usually do. But this is what I think. Like, I think if you're playing a campaign right now in Warhammer 3, the best races you can play are Dark Elves, Skaven, Vampire Counts, Greenskins, Chaos Dwarves, and yes, the B-tier ones. Just because they're B-tier doesn't make them bad. Anything below that, yeah, those are probably not ones I'd recommend, except with the exception of campaigns like Axiot or Borsources who break the mold. Anyway, that's all I had to say.